So, since I'm going to be talking about gaming primarily, what makes sense to me is basically the first video is what I think of as the most significant milestone that I have witnessed in regards to gaming in my lifetime. Now, it could probably be argued, and I might even argue that there are more significant milestones than what I'm about to present, right? Tennis for Two is like arguably the first video game, and perhaps the most significant milestone that we've seen. Probably half of the stuff that John Carmack has made ever is like the most, second most, third most, and so on significant milestones in gaming overall, but whatever. There was something that I personally witnessed that I haven't seen people talk about, and I consider it to be the most significant. And even if I don't think it is that objectively, I think it's something that might lend a little bit of extra perspective to video games in general, or video games as a medium, maybe. And that was, for me, the cultural shift in the way that, I guess, media viewed video games, or non-video game media viewed video games before and after Grand Theft Auto was released. So before Grand Theft Auto was released, video games only really ever showed up in other media in the news, right? No TV, no movies, none of that stuff. And they only showed up to be basically, well, blamed for the Columbine shootings, as it were, right? Like Doom was whatever. Anyway, they were only ever in the news, and they were only ever in the news as victims or villains, depending on how you want to look at it. And that was before Grand Theft Auto. After, didn't change too much, but I did notice two significant things kind of happen around the release of Grand Theft Auto, and certainly since then things have been getting a little bit more progressive, but I'll talk about that in a moment. The first significant thing that I noted was that Jon Stewart, who was basically the single source of truth for news in our admittedly liberal home, was talking about Grand Theft Auto as though it were a thing that he partook of and enjoyed. You talked about it the same way that he would talk about a movie or a book or something else that he had ingested. It wasn't a piece of news to be treated like every other piece of news that either, would be reported on with commentary or would be, reported on kind of tangentially. Like that was the Daily Show's whole thing, right? Was somebody else would do a report and then he would make fun of their report, right? And I think that kind of happened a few times with Grand Theft Auto 3. Like other news networks said, oh, it's, the devil incarnate because of this, that, and the other, and Stewart would make fun of it. But he also, in addition to that stuff, talked about it as someone who actually indulged in this stuff, actually experienced this stuff. And for Stewart, given his persona and all that, it wasn't really like a big surprise per se, but it was kind of mind-blowing to see a game dealt with or addressed in that way at all by a news persona, albeit a comedian or whatever, whatsoever. Because even after Grand Theft Auto, video games weren't really talked about or treated as a medium. They didn't show up again in TV or movies or whatever as regular things for quite some time, despite the fact that you would have, obviously television characters who would sit and watch television or talk about movies or whatever. And there are, of course, it's completely skipping my mind right now, but I know that there's like episodes of television or little sequences in movies or whatever that do this meta conversation about, say Scorsese or, Tarantino or something along those lines, right? But, video games were never accepted. They were never represented in any other form of media as essentially a thing that existed. And maybe that's just my perception, my perspective, what I'm seeing. Primarily I'm remembering like television shows and movies from the late 90s and early 2000s that were around that era that, made zero acknowledgement or virtually zero acknowledgement of video games at all. And I think that it's come out a little bit more as time has gone on. We've got, stuff going on in the background. I was rewatching Misfits, Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley is a very, in my mind, kind of accurate representation. It's unfortunate that, like, the baseline representation of what is like a nerd or a gamer or any of that kind of stuff right now is defined by Big Bang Theory. And that's kind of how everyone sees, I don't know, me or the person I think I am, and the people that I think kind of categorize into that. It's interesting to think that, major video game personalities like executives at Blizzard or, any of the YouTubers that do Let's Plays might be seen kind of that way. Although I guess, I have to give a hand to Matt and Trey that South Park has kind of been for a while now like an actual accurate representation of the way the world is without really leaving pieces out. So they have kids playing video games and stuff like that. More recently, in addition to just like Silicon Valley and stuff like that, we had House of Cards, which felt a little bit more like somebody kind of injecting their hobbies. It was like, oh, look at this particular game, it's pretty cool, rather than necessarily having people that talk about games. Kind of reminded me a little bit of like going back to Standalone Complex and having them just talk excessively about Catcher in the Rye, right? Like, hey, we have a message, it's just maybe not quite shilling, but feels a little close. So the other significant memory that I had, and this might have just been like a circumstance of age or something like that, but it didn't really feel like that, I guess, at the time. So a lot of conversations, and I was a young teenager at the time, still basically a child and kind of like in the throes of puberty, as it were. So a lot of the conversations that I had were basically with, at best, an unintentional air of condescension, and even when it was talking about video games, it's like, oh, so you enjoying that Mario game sport or whatever, right? When adults would want to talk about that or anything, not to try to say anyway. It was atypical to have a conversation with an adult where we were truly equals, right? Even if we were doing something together, right? Like going to an amusement park or, going shopping or, whatever. And even if we saw eye to eye, the conversations didn't really seem as equals. And I remember sitting with a friend and some, I don't know, male elder person involved in this kid's life. I don't remember if it was like an uncle or his mom's boyfriend or something along those lines, but it was an older gentleman that like was old enough to have a career, and he at the time may not be as old as I am now. I don't really remember, like retrospectively it's hard to remember, but he certainly felt like an adult to me at the time. And this friend of mine and I and this adult were able to have a conversation around Grand Theft Auto 3 from the perspective of being kind of equals in this world. His experiences were equal to our experiences, and that's a whole thing aside, but one of the things that I think is really great about video games, that you can take two people across age and gender, and even like in some cases, not all games, but some cases and whatever, physical handicap, and just traverse all of those things and give them the same world to experience in the same way. And of course, no two people are the same in like in a game, in a competitive setting or whatever, and a lot of that has to do with like skill and reaction time and nervous system, all that, still factors there. But at the very least, like the way we experienced the world, the way we ingested it, we were able to communicate as equals of this ingestion. And that was the first time I was able to do something like that around video games. I could do that like a little bit, but when I did that with books, it was always like, oh yeah, it was with an English teacher who read it 1,000 times. It was, with an adult who read it, 20 years ago or something like that. And I guess the most common thing was we could go into movies, but all of the adults would see it from the perspective of like, my dad saw Star Wars in the theaters, right? So we would go see a sci-fi movie, and he would have that memory to compare it to, and that baseline. And even nowadays we have that like same kind of similar thing, right? Of the graphics in that game really weren't all that impressive. And of course, all of us that experienced Grand Theft Auto 3 when it first came out were like, oh my god, this is the best looking game that's ever happened. So I don't think it, like, maybe necessarily single-handedly changed the way that media talked about video games, because I still don't think we're there yet, right? I still think that, like, video games are starting to pervade as a subculture into, I don't know, I guess Western culture is what I experience, or internet culture at best, I don't know. But back then, video games were their own culture. Absolutely. They weren't a part of anything else. They didn't pervade into anywhere else. And looking anywhere else, looking at any other media that I can remember at all from the late 90s, early 2000s, you wouldn't be able to tell that video games existed, or they might be some, discarded side note in the background or something like that. So Grand Theft Auto 3 didn't do any, like, major thing to change that, but it was the milestone demarcation of when things started to get different from my perspective. And personally, I find that very interesting.